Another lesson is, we had a lot of technical lessons learned, but the ones we learned about project management are even better on this. And one of the big ones is each of our IPT leaders that we had needs to be a little project manager in and of himself, with the responsibility and authority delegated to him. Responsibility and authority, we usually talk in terms of, someone is given the responsibility and the authority. Well, within NASA, what we tend to see is people given the responsibility but not the authority. And if you do that, people quickly learn which way is the path up to the top. And so they will subvert that responsibility and go right to the authority.
Another lesson within first stage is getting the engineering community involved earlier. 1X was put together rather quickly. It wasn't even called 1X at the time, and the idea was up front that it would have little engineering oversight. That proved to be a bad assumption, and we should have known up front that was a bad assumption. Once we got closer to flight and delivering hardware, Marshall Space Flight Center management, obviously they got more involved, which meant engineering was going to get more involved too. So getting that engineering community involved earlier would have helped us later in the day. I mean, we had a lot of people that were getting up to speed. What is 1X? Having to go back and read requirements documents. Ideally, that community. There's always going to be turnover in the engineering community, but if you've got the same engineering oversight team essentially from day one, following you all the way through your design reviews, through acceptance reviews, through your flight attendance readiness reviews, it makes it a little bit easier.
Within the Marshall organization, the interfaces between the contractor, the Marshall Engineering Organization, and the Marshall Project Office, I would say the roles and responsibilities of that relationship, again, if I were to be king of the world and had a chance to do it over again, I would do a better job of cleaning up and better defining what the roles and responsibilities were going to be, because it's nice to all say you're going to throw your badge on the table when you walk in and you're all one big happy family, but you still have to maintain that level of contractual responsibility as well and know where the boundaries are of where you end and the next guy begins as well, to maintain the proper protocol. And so there was times of angst that we had in maintaining that proper relationship, and that would be a lesson learned for myself, but anybody else too that manages this kind of a project, to establish those roles and responsibility, and then it's the project manager's job to make sure they are properly executed and kind of be the police force of that.
The launch director for Ares 1X is very different than the launch director we have for Shuttle, and the role is different. The role is very different than the launch director format we use for the launch services program. And it was designed in order to be more efficient in the long run. But we wanted to try it in this first flight test case just to see where the bumps in the road were, and we certainly found them. And so by going through that process, we learned the role of the launch director underneath the current shuttle program, is really that to bring the launch team to a point where we're ready to go launch. And then they report to the mission management team that the launch team is now ready. The mission management team is working independently, making sure there's no other issues that are out there, no other issues that the launch team may not be aware of, and then bring those to the forefront, and then we resolve those. And then in the end, the mission management team says they're not working anything, the launch can proceed. The launch director then takes the launch through the rest of the countdown and through T0. In the Ares 1X case, the launch director's role was moved up like a half a step, to say it was really the leader of this mission management team. We didn't call it the mission management team, we called it the launch authority team. But that launch authority team had the same kind of responsibilities that on the shuttle world we would say was the mission management team. Whereas this launch authority team had to understand what the risks to flight were, what the risks to the test flight were, what the risk to the range was going to be. Although the range makes those calls, we had to try to identify what those risks were. And if there was risk to the mission, then the mission manager, the program manager, and the launch director together had to make a decision about whether or not we should go try to fly that particular day. It's very new to NASA. It was very new to the folks that have been doing human space flight for many, many years. And so populating that and getting concurrence on how to go operate that became almost a full-time job for me for, I would say, about 6 weeks. And I did not appreciate that it was going to be that much of an energy. From a launch director standpoint, no longer was I waiting for an input from the program. I was part of the program making that determination. That was the key difference. We ended up going at the agency level to talk about those things, because that's where you're going to get the tech authorities to buy in to this plan that says, here's how you're going to all go off and buy risk. And again, I think the appreciation and for the next program is, if you're going to do something different than what the standard is and what we have been practicing, like in the human spaceflight world, start that population and that discussion much earlier with all the stakeholders, especially those that are external. We got buy-in from the program folks months before we got any buy-in from Tech Authority for Engineering and Tech Authority for Safety. And it took many, many iterations to try to get those two tech authorities to buy into what we're eventually doing. And we modified it. I won't say we eventually got them to the point where they totally agreed with what we're doing. That's an iteration process that we had to put in place. So for the future programs, whatever the future launch vehicles are going to be, the idea is your decision-making process, laid in countdown, needs to be understood and populated with all the right tech authorities as early as possible to get that buy-in.
The way they organized the project early on, they asked for KSC involvement in certain areas like SE&I, developing the test requirements, developing the launch criteria, and not just being a member of the team like we are on shuttle. We were actually leaders of those teams. So I think that was, to me, one of the biggest lessons learned, that, you know, KSC had the expertise to go do that. The agency relying on us for that expertise was actually a plus for the project as well, because we knew what we needed to test the vehicle, and we helped the designers actually develop those test requirements, and then that ended up, you know, falling down to the actual work instructions on the floor.
SE&I has a huge role. They have got to do the real integration. They've got to be a real technical authority on the whole rocket. And on Ares 1X, like I said, they weren't staffed properly up front. They were playing catch-up the whole time. If you staff them up front properly, and I would tend, for a future project, to actually give them probably a little more than they think they need. You always underestimate a little bit, because you're trying to be cautious. You don't want to be too large. I would tend to think, you know, if I were a project manager in the future, I'd give them a little more than they think they need up front. And those people, trust me, they will come into work. There will be no shortage of work for anybody in an SE&I organization. So I would say that's another big one for us.
Establish those roles and responsibilities up front of who's responsible for what documents, what engineering, who's responsible for what, and make those roles and responsibilities clearly understood by the right people, because that, till the very end, that, you know, everybody obviously had ownership of their hardware, and typical human nature is they don't want to let go of their hardware, because those guys have been working on it so hard for a couple of years, and they didn't want to quite let go of their hardware at the Kennedy Space Center. In the meantime, Kennedy Space Center is saying, hey, we know how to do this, you guys back off, and it just created a lot of friction. And so till the very end, we did great, but it seemed like there was always a question on who was responsible for what. Especially things like, and I'm probably going to get in the weeds, but like requirements verification. Again, we set up the configuration management to verify all the requirements Kennedy was responsible for, but we couldn't quite convince some of the other IPTZ avionics guys, and even SE&I, that your job is to give KSC the requirements on a drawing. Kennedy's job is to go implement it, and if they can't, they have a process to say, hey, program, we didn't implement it, we're taking a waiver or an MR or something. For 1X, we had Glenn Research Center come down here and finish doing some of their work that they should have been done with at Glenn, and they didn't understand that processing hardware down here in the VAB when the shuttle's moving through is a lot different than continuing to process their hardware at Glenn when, you know, they've got pretty much full reign of their facility. So again, I keep saying it, but those roles and responsibilities in a perfect world, I don't know if that'd be smart to do again, because it just caused confusion, and it goes down to, you know, who's responsible for the configuration management. If their hardware's down here and they're working on their hardware, but they're in our facilities, we got to make sure they're safe. And so you can see how that just added a little bit to what we had to work through. We did. It was tremendous. But again, if you define those roles and responsibilities, and once the hardware gets to KC, it's all the processing center's responsibility to finish processing it, and requirements being defined, and all that would be a little bit easier, I think, in the future. So those roles and responsibilities not being clearly defined causes problems till the end. So my 3-minute suggestion would be just define those roles and responsibilities as clearly as we can up front and document them, and that way we all understand who's responsible for what when everything comes together.
When you do a reorganization, roles change. So they need to make sure, people need to make sure when that happens, they evaluate the role and make sure they get the right personnel in those roles. A lot of times what happens when we do those changes, we just take that person, when it all of a sudden has this new role and responsibility, sometimes they don't necessarily have all the skill set in that new role and responsibility that they had when they were in their old role and responsibility, which is why they were there.